All right, so I'll go ahead and get us started here. I want to thank everyone for joining us and volunteering to take part in our community science program. We love we love seeing that growth and getting more people involved. And so my name is Ned Bowman, and I am the outreach coordinator with Great Basin Bird Observatory. We are based in Reno, Nevada, and we conduct research throughout Nevada. We actually do a lot of work in Arizona and a bit in the Eastern Sierra in California as well. And this is a recent initiative of ours that I'm going to be talking about this evening. But before I get into it, I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping kind of stuff that this is a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar. So if folks could just mind their mute buttons and make sure there's not background noise in the show. And then as far as questions go, I'm hoping that people feel comfortable chiming in and asking questions when they have them. And you can do that through the chat or through the Q&A or through the raise hand. I think those are all options. Um, and uh, and I'll stop and answer those as I have opportunity to do so in the presentation. But as opposed to saving them all to the end, I want to be able to answer them as they come up. And so you can see my email address listed there on this front page as well. And if anyone has other questions beyond what we're covering here, feel free to reach out and I'm happy to answer those as well. So without further ado, I will jump into our presentation about Pinyon Jays. I think I will. There we go. Okay, so I guess first things first is what is a pinyon jay? And I gather that most folks are familiar with the species and can probably recognize which one is the pinyon jay. But if anyone doesn't recognize which one is the pinyon jay, I'm happy to go into more detail about how we know which one of these birds is in fact a pinyon jay. Um, it's the bird on the bottom right with the relatively long bill and short tail and sort of compact body structure. And moving around clockwise from the upper left, we have a mountain bluebird, a California scrub jay, a Woodhouse's scrub jay, a western bluebird, our pinyon jay, the Steller's jay, and a blue grosbeak, all of which are fairly distinct physically and mostly separate by habitat. A couple of these overlap, and of course, California scrub jay is not found in Arizona, so that makes that one easy. And then just a couple more photos of pinyon jays from various angles. And you can see that that structure is really useful because I think that's the hardest part about pinyon jay identification is the fact that you don't always get a good look at the birds. They're often far away, flying distantly, vocalizing when they're flying overhead. And so learning how to recognize them based on sort of fleeting glimpses or obscure views or things like that. And so what I'm keying in on in pretty much all of these photos is that really long bill, the relatively short tail, compact body structure, and relatively long wings as far as the structure goes. The amount of blue in the plumage is pretty variable. The bird in the upper right is a juvenile, actually doing a sort of wing flutter begging action there. But juveniles can be pretty gray, with adult males being the brightest blue, and generally brightest blue in the face and the head, like that bird on the upper left there. And so hopefully this slide works. I included a few vocalizations just to go over what you typically hear, because these birds are very loud and their calls carry very far. And that is often the way in which I first detect the presence of the birds. And then you might see a sight, something like that, distant flock of birds, which based on their flight pattern and everything, and usually calls, can be recognized as pinyon jays. And so hopefully this is loud enough. And so those are some alarm calls. A rack series is what that's often referred to as. And again, if anyone can't hear, if we're having issues with that, please chime in and let me know because I can't really see the chat or anything here. So again, here's some more typical calls, a little quieter. So pretty nasal, again, very distinct. They have the similar sound quality to some other species, which I've got slides in a couple slides right after this to cover. And this, again, this is that rack series, which functions as sort of a distress or mobbing call. Let's see if I can hit that play button. And so again, that single repeated note is referred to as a series, and that's a generic term for all bird vocalizations. There's a number of species that will repeat a single note like that, and it's referred to as a series. And in pinyon jays, that particular series serves to basically call the birds to alarm. Let's see if this one will go. And again, hopefully y'all can hear that, but that's a rattle call and it's made by the females. All corvids have that. So Clark's nutcracker, Steller's jay, Woodhouse's scrub jay, all the females of these species have a rattle call. And at least in pinyon jays, it's rather uncommon. It's rather uncommon in all of them, but at least in pinyon jays, it's mostly given near the nesting areas. And so that can be sort of a clue that you're near a nesting area. But they have a ton of vocalizations, a really diverse repertoire, like most all corvids do. I don't know whether or not pinyon jays have a whisper song, but that's something that a lot of corvids have as well. But there's variations on these rattles, trills, churs, these near calls, and they all can kind of grade into more excited versions of the call that sound slightly different and serve different functions. But that's sort of a rundown of their typical vocalizations. There we go. Okay. And I just wanted to do a few slides of potential confusion species so you can hear the similarities to look for. And I don't think acorn woodpeckers, if they're close and heard well, can really be confused, but you'll hear the similarities when I play it. I think this is the one. And so you can hear the similarities there. That sounds really similar to that rack series that they do. Although you'll notice this wasn't quite given in a series. It was a single note repeated, but not in that series pattern. It wasn't that regular repetition. And then they gave some more typical calls in there. And then right at the end, you heard some drumming. So acorn woodpeckers are pretty vocal and they'll pretty much give themselves away with typical calls and or drumming. But if you hear that at a distance, you can potentially conflate that with a pinyon jay call. And here's sort of the more typical acorn woodpecker call. And so acorn woodpeckers are pretty social birds. There's usually a lot of them around, and there'll be a variety of vocalizations. So if you hear that confusion call, you might just kind of tune in and listen, like, was that what I thought it was? Listen for some of those chur calls or the drumming or something like that to cue into an acorn woodpecker. And of course, if there's a lot of oaks around, habitat can be a cue as well. Not that that's ever silver bullet to ID, but it can suggest, of course. And then also the Gambel's quail, their song is a single kind of caw note in that nasal range and around the same frequency. So here we'll play that as well. So it's short, nasal, and that's the song of the male, the advertisement song. The habitat is going to be a pretty good cue to separate those out. And again, the call itself is pretty distinct. Most Pinyon Jay calls are not that short. The notes tend to be a little longer. They tend to be a little more overslurred, and they're going to carry farther and sound louder. And these guys, Scrub Jay, I think sound very distinct, but at least at a distance that Pinyon Jays, when they're excited or particularly agitated, their calls can kind of grade into more screechy sounding. So we'll just play that to just remind everyone. And so that's pretty distinct and easy to separate. But at a distance, and if it's an excited Pinyon Jay, it's at least worth considering and being careful with. And of course, Clark's Nutcracker are incredibly diverse in terms of their vocalizations. They make all kinds of sounds. I can't actually remember exactly which calls I put on here, so we'll just go ahead and play these. So again, these sort of nasal wailing calls. And like with most of these guys, habitat is going to be a useful separator. And actually particularly so with Clark's Nutcracker. They're sort of the high elevation analog to Pinyon Jays. Pinyon Jays are to Pinyon Pines, sort of as Clark's Nutcrackers are to Limber Pine, actually White Bark Pine, excuse me. But they will eat Limber Pine, but they are particularly tied to the White Bark Pine. And so elevation's typically a good separator, but because pines are such variability in their crop production, there can be overlap, and Clark's nutcrackers will certainly come down and forage on pinyon pine nuts if the white bark pines are not producing. Pinyon jays will certainly go uphill if the pinyon pines are not producing. And they are both very strong flyers. So habitat is suggestive but not definitive. And then I'll play this other vocalization as well. So again, they sound pretty distinct, but just in case, it's worth considering. And if you're not hearing the birds well, just to sort of be aware of all these potentially similar sounding species. And so as we get into our discussion of the pinyon jay, I'll cover their distribution here first. These are two range maps from different sources, Birds of the World Online and the Breeding Birds Survey data. So on the Birds of the World, you can see they cover outside of the United States. Excuse me. Whereas the Breeding Birds Survey data is specific to the US. However, you can see a little bit of the density of the population, and you do have clusters there in central Nevada, northern Arizona, west central New Mexico, sort of where the concentrations are. And then those fringe populations further north up into Montana, Idaho, Oregon, where you can't really intuit that from the range maps you see in the field guides. So just getting at sort of the nomadic nature of these birds and their tendency to move around. and noting that southernmost population in northern Baja California there. And here I think it's sort of fun and useful to overlay the map, the range map of the pinyon jay with the ranges of our pinyon pines. And you can see that the bird ranges much further north than the tree, and the tree ranges a bit further south than the bird does. Down all through Baja, and the jays don't quite get that far south. And so the pinyon jay is just a very fascinating bird. They're always learning, always teaching me new things when I'm out there observing them. They're very specialized in their relationship with the pinyon pine. They're sort of that classic mutualistic relationship with the pinyon pines, where they disperse the nuts of the pine, and then so the pine benefits in that way, and of course the jay benefits from the protein-rich food source of the pine nuts. And with that, they inhabit a variety of habitats that are used differently throughout the year. And I've got a few more slides later on to talk about that. But in general, they are harvesting pine nuts in the late summer and early fall when the nuts are becoming ripe. And they're caching these nuts either in the ground, in trunks of trees, in various locations. Um, and surviving off of these nuts throughout the winter and then into the early spring as well when they initiate breeding, which they do a bit earlier than most other co-occurring songbirds. And so then in the spring and summer, they transition to eating a bit more insects, and then they'll still visit their caches, of course, that are left over from the winter. But this is incredibly variable based on the pine nut crop. So in some years, they may have to rely more heavily on insects or on limber pine nuts or on other food sources. And that can be a driver of the different types of habitats that they occupy and the areas they occupy as well. Cone crop failure in one area can push them to look in new areas or new elevations. But they're that classic specialist with the pinyon pine nut, and that is 90% of their food source is from pinyon pine nuts. The other really neat thing about pinyon jays is their social structure of these flocks. They're typically seen in very large flocks, which this changes throughout the year as well. The flocks tend to be the largest in the winter and in the fall when all the family groups are grouped together. And flocks will contain several family groups. And the large flocks that I see are 200 to 300 birds. And then throughout the year, you'll see this flock sort of break up and do different things. Where in the breeding season, the spring and summer, it's more common to see individuals or smaller groups where they're pretty much just associating with their immediate family members. And then in the fall and the winter, they're a bit less tied to that immediate family, and breeding is less of a focus, and they're more communal in nature and caching together and all of that. But they have communal nesting and roosting, as well as some cooperative breeding, which I will elaborate on in a little bit here. But they nest in these colonies of 30 to 50 nests, typically in a certain part of the home range where the tree cover is more dense than in others, and then they will roost in similar areas and forage throughout the rest of the home range that may not have as dense of tree cover. And there is documented cooperative breeding in which the young males will help provision the offspring of the next generation. So that would be sort of the second calendar year males will help with that food deliveries and whatnot for the next generation. And so I mentioned before that their diet is pine nuts and almost exclusively pinyon pine nuts, but they will supplement with nuts from other pines, and they do occupy areas that don't have pinyon pine, as I highlighted before. And I suspect that in areas like that, their heavy reliance on yellow pine, ponderosa, and Jeffrey pine. They've also been documented to eat juniper berries, though I suspect with such a specialized relationship to pine nuts, they're not getting much nutrition from juniper berries, and it's not a preferred food source. But in years where they have scarce pine nuts, they make do with what they can. And then in the spring and summer, insects become very important to the feeding of the young, basically based on their seasonal availability. And so they don't have to have such a heavy reliance on the pine nuts at that time of year, because that's also the time of the year farthest from when they have harvested, right? If the nuts become, or if the cones produce ripe nuts in the fall and late summer, that next spring and summer, by that point in the year, they're going to be sort of working off of whatever's left, and that can be very little in some years. So they rely on insects a bit heavier at that time of the year. And so I mentioned that they are caching species. So they cache these pine nuts that they harvest. So that bird right there is investigating that cone. And I actually really like that photo because it shows a few fun things about the bird. You can see all that goopy resin dripping off of those fresh cones, which are difficult for wildlife to deal with. That resin can gum up fur and feathers really effectively and put a real damper on the capacity to forage. And so pinyon jays are actually featherless at the base of the bill. Their genus name, Gymnorhinus, means naked nose. Gymnorhinus cyanocephala is the full Latin name, and it basically means naked nose, blue head. And so these resinous cones are difficult for a lot of other species to deal with, but pinyon jays, because they don't have feathers at the base of their bill, can get into these cones a bit earlier than other species, giving them a bit of a leg up on would-be competitors, and that their bill doesn't get gummed up with that resin because there's no feathers to gum up. So early in the season, they'll fly off with entire cones. You may have noticed the photo in one of my earlier slides of a bird flying with an entire cone in its bill. And that's typical of early in the season when the cones are not open and the birds can't pry into them. But later in the season, pinyon pine cones do open on their own, which is a contrast to some other species of pine that rely on wildfire or wildlife to open the cones. But later in the season, pinyon pine cones will open on their own. And at that point in the season, like these cones here, the birds can actually pry the scales open and get the nuts without removing the cone from the tree. But when they do remove the cone from the tree, they'll fly to a perch and use it like an anvil. Basically, they'll set it on this big flat surface and hammer at it with the bill to chip into those nuts. Oh. So in this video here that my colleague took, you can see a bird. I believe this is a bird retrieving a cache from a site in the ground. And very quietly, you can hear some sort of atypical vocalizations in there with this flock. But ground caches are sort of the most common that we see, and it's often in loose and sandy substrate, which is just easier for them to get into. They can pick these cones, bury these cones a few inches, pretty much as deep as their bill can shove them into the ground, which hides them from other species. And then they'll use, so you can see that bird just popped a few nuts into his crop there. And they can store, I think it's like 30 to 40 nuts in that crop and fly off with them. And it's not always obvious when they have nuts in the crop. So we'll talk about that later when we're talking about how to describe the behavior that you're observing on our survey form. But basically, they're caching in the ground in areas where the substrate is loose and sandy and they can, and also where there is a favorable aspect for less snow cover, because that's a huge factor for them in the winter. They don't want these nuts to be buried in snow. Obviously, they can't get to them. So they use south-facing, steeper slopes. That's why they'll put a number of them in crevices of tree bark and that kind of thing, so that they don't have to worry about them being buried with snow. But as I mentioned before, it's this coevolution between the birds and the pines where both benefit in that the dispersal of seeds benefits the pine by spreading them and new habitat, which it kind of benefits the bird in a way. They're architects of their own habitat. These caches that go unharvested germinate and turn into new stands of pines. But then these caches obviously also serve as a winter food supply for the bird. And in order for this to work, the pines must be producing more than the birds need. which on average works out. Although what we've seen in recent years is several low years in which the pines have not really produced more than the birds need, and the birds have had to look elsewhere. And their caching strategy can be classified as a scatter hoarder as opposed to a larder hoarder, like the acorn woodpeckers that have their granary trees where all of their acorns are cached in one tree, which is maybe familiar to you guys that spend time in acorn woodpecker territory. We don't have them in Nevada really, so we don't see a lot of that. But pinyon jays are scatter hoarders, and they'll kind of distribute their nuts far and wide across the landscape with a loose patch of ground having several caches, but just kind of one nut per hole. And they'll use this area, they'll fill it up to its capacity, whatever that may be, and move on to a new area. And they can commute pretty great distances between these caching areas. Go. And for their nesting and reproduction, I mentioned a little bit of this before, but they start earlier than most other species. But this is opportunistic and adaptable, like many aspects of their biology. They'll abandon nesting efforts in inclement weather, they will delay in harsh winters, and they can begin early when conditions are favorable. But in a typical year, courtship will begin in the winter, and nest building will be completed sort of early spring, almost by the time winter is over, there'll be nests completed. I've seen birds building nests as early as the second week of February in northern Nevada. And then, of course, we had heavy storms after that particular year, and I suspect they abandoned those efforts. But they will get that started as soon as they can, and that's another way in which they get a leg up on competitors and co-occurring species. But the eggs will be hatching in the early spring, and then that way their nestlings are fledging before most species have completed their nesting. Sort of early spring is when a lot of the migratory birds are just beginning to set up territories and build nests, where pinyon jays already have fledglings being provisioned at that time of year. In these photos, you can see, well, that one photo on the right, you can see what I mean by the colonial nature of their nesting, where they typically don't put more than one nest per tree, but are usually in adjacent trees or a few trees over. And so what we see in the Great Basin is about 30 to 50 nests in a colony, although what our field crews in Arizona have been reporting is a little different than that. So it is very interesting when you guys down there are able to find nests and get this information. Although I guess I just worth mentioning a word of caution about looking for nests. Kind of don't do that really. They're very sensitive, I guess. While the nesting information is valuable to us, they're incredibly sensitive to disturbance, and they'll abandon nests at the slightest indication of stress. And so we really don't want to be stressing them because I'm sure you're all aware that they've been petitioned for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and the Fish and Wildlife Service did just announce that they warrant a review, so they are going to be looking into it. So the last thing we want to be doing for these birds is disturbing their nests and making them abandon them. But it is interesting to note that in some of our Arizona surveys, we've found nest quote unquote colonies of 1 to 5 nests in one patch of trees, and then a few hundred meters away, another 1 to 5 nests. And so the clusters are a bit looser. And as far as the cooperative breeding goes, it's always the male. It's always with males. It's never young females. See, Russell Balda and John Marsluff did a lot of this work in Flagstaff in the, oh geez, I want to say the 70s they did this, but that's where a lot of the stuff we know about pinyon jays comes from. But they found that over 95% of the helper birds were sons from the previous year, and that actually ran in certain family lineages more than others. And in the family lineages where helping was a noted behavior, it did seem to further the lineage, and non-helper lineages were more likely to go extinct, as in that family line was more likely to go extinct, whereas the ones that were cooperatively breeding were able to further that reproductive potential. And that's basically the long and short of their cooperative breeding. You just got a few more photos of nests here. They're maybe larger than you would expect for a bird this size, and very similar to Woodhouse's scrub jay nest, this sort of messy cup nest of big sticks on the outside, lined with finer grasses and hairs on the inside of the cup there. And on the right, you can see more sort of the placement in the tree, and there's even a little bit of a blue feather poking out there. So they're typically pretty well concealed in bushy, dense, shrubby trees in bushier, more heavily covered parts of the home range. So next we'll go into a discussion of habitat, but it could be a fine time to take any questions about natural history if anyone had anything. If anyone wanted me to elaborate on any of those, I can sometimes blow through this pretty quickly because it's like second nature to me, and I forget that not everyone knows all the stuff about pinyon jays. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in now. And if not, we'll just jump into habitat stuff. All right, so I guess we'll jump into the habitat discussion, which I won't go too much about habitat. I'll just sort of show some photos and explain what that is. But these photos are both shots that I've taken in Nevada of areas where I've found pinyon jays. And while they are considered pinyon juniper obligates, and indeed they are, 90% of their diet comes from pinyon pine nuts. They have what we're seeing is a pretty heavy reliance on these ecotones and edge habitat. And I suspect that's related to well, it is suspected that that's related to their spatial memory being more better suited to open areas. But the long and short is they have a heavy reliance on ecotones and edge habitat, which is often overlooked in the natural world as this in-between zone of two other habitat types that forms a distinct habitat type of its own. And so these are typically caching sites, and a lot of their home range can look like this and just have denser patches in some areas than others. And so pinyon juniper woodlands, again, they're the most common forest type in the western US, very familiar to all of us, generally middle to higher elevations with cooler temperatures and more precipitation. Further north, they will use juniper monocultures, and it's probably just where they nest and roost, and then they commute to ponderosa pines to harvest. It's actually not very well understood, their ecology and their spatial use of the landscape further north. We don't really know how that all works out, but it's well documented that there's plenty of pinyon jays resident in areas with no pinyon pine, juniper, and ponderosa. So, and they're inhabiting these areas with species like western tanager and black-throated gray warblers and juniper titmice and that kind of thing. Sagebrush steppe, and it's sort of a they use the open areas below pinyon juniper woodland. It's not always sagebrush steppe, but they do very frequently use pure sagebrush in the Great Basin, sometimes as far as 500 meters from any pinyon juniper woodland, and it's valuable caching areas. And they'll inhabit these areas with other sagebrush obligates like sage thrashers, sagebrush sparrow, greater sage grouse, that kind of thing. And you'll frequently see them commuting over these areas, flying high and loudly between ponderosa or pinyon pine stands. Ponderosa and Jeffrey pine woodland seems to be pretty common in their habitat usage throughout their range, and of varying importance depending on the availability of pinyon pine nuts. But it's pretty likely just related to the availability of nearby pinyon pines. And ponderosa is often mixed with pinyon juniper. From what I've seen in northern Arizona, that's really common to see pinyon pine mixed in ponderosa forest and plenty of pinyon jays in what appear to be pure ponderosa stands. So that is, we would consider this pinyon jay habitat, which will become relevant when I talk about absence records in the Survey 123 form, where if you're in Pinyon Jay, what we consider Pinyon Jay habitat for 10 minutes or more and don't detect birds, that can be considered an absence record, which I'll explain later when we're talking about the app. And then other open areas. So sort of the analog to sagebrush steppe in the Great Basin, where in other parts of the range that don't really have sagebrush steppe, this can be Joshua tree woodland or creosote or grassland or something like that. But the point is that they will use pure shrubland for caching, and it's not uncommon. So this habitat type is valuable to them and is worth considering when we're looking at landscape management and conservation. That it's not just the pinyon pine woodlands, it is these open areas adjacent to them as well. And the edge habitat, like I was saying before, it's this natural gradient between two other distinct habitat types where they basically get the best of both worlds of the pine nuts from the dense stands and then the open areas where they can more easily cache. But they'll use areas like this with stuff like gray vireo and blue-gray gnatcatcher and black-chin sparrow and those kind of things, some of your more open area birds. And here's just a few photos of that ecotone edge habitat, more sparse trees, that kind of thing. But again, all of these photos are of areas where I have seen pinyon jays. So with that, um, cool. Pinyon jays are awesome, but why do we care? And that's basically the meat of the matter here. Now that we have all that background info, it puts all of this into context of these massive population declines. They've lost more than half of their population in the last 50 years. The causes are not exactly clear. Not to say we have no idea, but to say that we don't know specifically how all these factors are related to produce this effect of a massive population crash. They have this very complex life history that further complicates all of that, where they use these different habitat types at different times of year. So it isn't just this habitat type is important, it's this matters at this time of year, this matters at this time of year. And sort of because of all of that, we have this inability to apply our standard survey techniques, where typical area searches and point counts are not really suitable for getting the information we need, where point count techniques are great for territorial songbirds, but pinyon jays are not that. And typical area searches are much smaller than the areas that pinyon jays use. So we needed to modify all of these to come up with a good protocol for getting this information. And then, of course, last year in May of 2022, they were petitioned for federal listing. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gave us their 90-day ruling, a cool 450 some odd days later this year, where they told us that they indeed may be warranted. And so they are going to conduct a review of the species. And in another number of years, we'll hear back about that. But all of this coupled with environmental changes really puts pressure on land managers and conservationists to act quickly to figure out what's going on because land management is happening in areas where pinyon jays live, and we don't really understand the relationship between these, and it's not always a consideration when landscape management is occurring. And so in order to more effectively guide this, we need to understand how specifically how the birds are using these different habitat types. So this graph in the upper right, the way to interpret that is that that middle line is sort of what we believe to be the population decline, and those two bars above it and below it, the lines above it and below it, are sort of the confidence interval, where it could be as steep as the upper line, or it could be as mellow as the bottom line. Either way, it's a pretty drastic picture of a massive population decline. And at the same time as all of that, we're seeing a lot of these environmental variables occurring, right? We've got wildfire, we've got a history of fire suppression, we've got climate change, we've got erratic precipitation events, livestock grazing, widespread and all over the place. And then we've got changes in the pinyon juniper woodland as well, where in the bottom left is representing what's referred to as pinyon juniper expansion or encroachment, where they're marching downhill and colonizing shrublands. And then the two photos of that sequence there is showing infill of pinyon juniper woodlands, where the stands are actually becoming more dense. And that's almost the most important point of these environmental trends Because if you think about that, it's like, how can their ostensibly, how can their habitat be increasing while this bird's populations are plummeting, right? If they love pinyon pine nuts so much, how is more woodland bad for them? And not to say that that's how to interpret that, but that's these two things are happening, right? We're having infill of woodlands and expansion of trees, and the birds are declining. So how does that add up? And that's what we're trying to get at here with our study. And so what we've been doing to try to understand this is that we've been GBBO has been studying pinyon jays for a long time. That's my director, our boss there in the lower left photo, who's been studying pinyon jays since the early 90s, I think. And so we've done some focused studies with telemetry, nest observation, sort of territory and home range mapping of specific flocks. And then we have our statewide Nevada bird count program, which is it consists of point count surveys throughout the state of Nevada. And as I was mentioning before, these point count surveys are not the best tool to get the kind of information we need to know, but because that monitoring program is so extensive throughout the state of Nevada, it has actually provided a lot of Pinyon Jay data for us and serves as sort of a baseline to jump off of how to where to go with the rest, where to go with future work and how to get at other answering other questions. So our Nevada bird count program is a statewide monitoring program that began in the early 2000s, shortly after the Nevada Breeding Bird Atlas. And it's been a long time since we've had true statewide coverage. We've had a number of contracts in various parts of the state, but true statewide coverage it's been a long time since that has happened. But the early data has informed and has informed a lot of our knowledge about pinyon jays in Nevada. And so I said they're not territorial songbirds, and I don't know if I need to explain that, but basically, for example, a yellow warbler is a territorial songbird that has a very small home range. And if you're conducting a point count, a 10-minute point count, that bird is going to be singing, singing, singing. It's going to be on its territory. Pinyon jays might be 4 kilometers away in another corner of their home range at that point, and you won't detect them on that survey, but that point can still be important to them. And in that way, we don't capture that with that survey technique. And some of our more focused studies, our telemetry studies, we've done these in the Desitoya Mountains in central Nevada, the Snake Range in eastern Nevada, Pine Nut Mountain Range in western Nevada, just south of Reno, and a bit in southern Idaho as well. We've done some telemetry. But this has informed us about home range size and the variability between flocks and some of the seasonal use of different habitat types, differences in where they roost in the home range and where they're foraging and where they're caching. So basically, this telemetry data has informed us that our point count data is not telling us the full picture. And this is where we learned about quote unquote commuter birds that are nesting and roosting in juniper stands and traveling many miles to pinyon pine to harvest nuts. And this map we put together with some of that telemetry data. This flock is in the Pine Nut Mountains outside of Carson City, south of Reno. But we're found that they're foraging within a half a kilometer of sagebrush edge. And they're often caching in pure sagebrush, sometimes miles from the edge of the pinyon juniper woodland. So this edge orientation is a key aspect of their biology that sort of conflicts with some of the traditional knowledge of them being pinyon juniper obligates, but it doesn't really conflict that in the sense that they're both happening. It's not mutually exclusive, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That while both of these things are happening, and how do we make sense of that and put that into a picture that we can communicate to land managers in a meaningful way. Before I leave this slide, I guess just mentioning that I did some of the telemetry on this flock, and we found them occupying an area of 10 square kilometers, something like 4,000 acres. So when I say they occupy large tracts of land and our typical survey techniques don't work, that's what I'm getting at, is that that's a huge area and there are serious difficulties in capturing that with a single survey. But in addition to that huge home range size, they're nomadic in the sense that the variability in the pine nut crop pushes them to new areas. You lay that over the fact that these landscapes are steep and difficult to traverse for us as surveyors. Like that's a lot of effort and energy to be trekking up and down these mountains. There's often not roads. It's a serious limitation to our ability to collect the data. And while they are very loud, noisy birds, and when they're on the landscape, you often know it, they can be surprisingly secretive. And I've had this experience a number of times where I've been doing Pinyon Jay surveys and I'm in their midst and I don't even realize it until I spook them. And suddenly there's birds flushing from all around me that were foraging totally silently. And then they're flushing by the hundreds in with noisy calls. So all of these make typical survey techniques difficult, and we have had to come up with new ways to get the information we need. And that is where our Survey 123 comes in. And so what we're going to do now is talk about our Survey 123, and I'll explain a little bit more about how it happened and why that is the approach we're taking. And I'd like to give you all a moment to download Survey 123 if you haven't done so. We probably can't download and create the accounts all in tonight's workshop, but the way it works, if you have not done so yet, is that you download this survey form to your phone with the free Survey 123 app, and then you log on to our community hub and you can create an account. And so on my next slide here, this QR code goes to the create account page. And so if you haven't done so, you can scan that QR code and that'll get you to the specific create account page within our data hub that we've created. And that'll be a username and password that you'll want to remember because you'll use that to log in to the Survey 123 app that you then download to your phone. And then once you've done that, you send me an email or us at outreach@gbbo an email letting us know the username and we can share the survey form with you and you'll be able to download that to your phone. And again, if folks haven't done that, you can send me an email and we can figure all that out. But if anyone has any questions about that, I can stop for a second and we can talk about that before I get into the nuts and bolts of the data collection.
Ned, I was going to just, while people are thinking about whether they have questions and if they've gotten far enough to ask about any of that, I was going to chime in and say that there is a NTU NAU group, so everybody should identify themselves as belonging to that group as well.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. That's a good point. That lets me know what data collection team to put you on and sort of organize all of our volunteers. So when you're creating that username, you can just add that suffix to your username with an underscore NTU, and that way I'll know which team to put you on. And of course, you can just let me know in the email you send me that you're part of that group, and that's where I will put you. And so what we did was this data hub. It's an online database that's globally accessible, freely shared. Everyone can log on and see that information. Um, yes, I have a question in the chat about repeating that group name. Yes, NTU is that. So if I'll type into the chat, if you just have your username be and don't use Pinyon J for your username. That's what everyone has done that, and we have like 300 volunteers, so it's not you won't be the first one to name yourself Pinyon J, but I'll just give an example of what we mean. So if I was part of the NTU, I would do something like that, and it doesn't have to be your name; it can be anything. But if you just do that underscore NTU, then I'll know where to put you. And so basically what this is it's new tools. And so we are developing this as we go. And it's, yeah, there's an amount of bearing with us as we go because Esri is figuring this out as well as we are. But basically, it's an online database. There's a map view output of all of the data that's been collected by our volunteers. It's a clearinghouse of training resources, survey tips, background information, papers published by GBBL. And that's basically your one-stop shop for all things Pinyon J. I have another question in the chat, it looks like, about where we can find the email. I'm going to type my email address into the chat here.
Yeah, I think a few people joined after you had shown your email address, so.
Yeah, and so there's my email address. I've got it on another slide later as well, and the first slide. But yeah, reach out to me, and then I'll put you on the right team. And if you didn't add the NAU or NTU to the username, that from my point of view, that's not a big deal. I think that's more of that's just as long as we get you on the team. Different organizations have had different preferences on that, and that some have wanted all of their volunteers to definitely have that, and some have it's not been as big of a deal. But the long and short is that you need to get on the right team, and that way we can provide valuable stats like how many data points have been collected by the NTU team, how many volunteers do we have, and it makes it easier to get that kind of thing. So why did we go this route and go into this whole detail of creating this and this great citizen science platform called eBird already exists? And the reason is, well, first off, eBird is fantastic. It's a hugely valuable resource to so many researchers and provides so much information about birds where people go. And pinyon jays are not always where people go. They're not at your birdiest hotspots. They're not at these popular, easy to get to locations. So we don't have a ton of information that's particularly valuable from eBird because of pinyon jay behavior as well. Pinyon jays are often flying over from foraging location to foraging location. And that's great to know that they're in the area, but that doesn't tell us about linking a specific behavior type with a specific habitat type. And that's the crux of this effort, is our ability to link this habitat type is critical for foraging. This habitat type is critical for caching. Therefore, we need to protect all of this. So with the citizen science program, we're able to make those links. And then also the systematic absence points. eBird doesn't have a real great way to do that. Like you could submit a checklist and put 0 pinyon jays, and that would tell us that there are no pinyon jays there. But generally, people are not doing that, right? You don't go out and put 0 emus on your eBird checklist because if you didn't see them, you didn't see them. You would have listed them if you did. um, but what we have is a systematic way to record that, and that's a very valuable tool for creating models of occupancy, is knowing where the birds are not, as well as knowing where they are. And that's what I was saying before, where if you spend 10 minutes in what we consider pinyon jay habitat type and do not detect the birds, you can submit an absence record. And then that accumulation of absence records will produce a pattern, and we're able to read into that and come up with something valuable to communicate to land managers about areas that they're not using. So maybe that's an area that you can target with your pinyon juniper clear cutting, for example. Um, yeah, that's the long and short of why not eBird. eBird's a great starting place, and I do frequently find myself checking on eBird to see, hey, where have pinyon jays been seen recently? But it basically just says where someone has seen it at some point, and it doesn't have the valuable information that we need to actually act in a meaningful way for pinyon jay conservation. And so I didn't really explain the Pinyon Jay Working Group. And that's sort of the birthplace of all of this, where all this originated, was a Partners in Flight collaboration of all of the world's leading experts on Pinyon Jays are in this working group trying to develop a protocol that will effectively gather the information we need, right? I mentioned point count doesn't work very well. The telemetry is of limited use. And then we did this. And so this is an idea that the working group had, that while we implemented this landscape level protocol, which is basically gigantic area searches of a few kilometers by a few kilometers. We also have this this community science effort where it can fill in the gaps between the randomized locations of the landscape level protocol, and it can be used in a way that suits your needs, basically, to maximize data collection capacity, where it's sort of a choose your own adventure thing, and it can be as involved as you want it to be and as opportunistic as you want it to be if you don't want to be very involved. And I think I explained all these points on the slide already, that it's a free community account, it's a free app, it's on your phone or tablet, it works when you don't have reception in the field, and all of your forms are automatically geo-referenced to a specific location and transmitted to our online database and will populate on this map view that I have in my next slide. So when you log on to the hub, that is a screenshot of the hub that is now a little dated, but I took that screenshot. It's probably a couple months old at this point. But that's our survey results tab, and you can click on each of those points and get information about that record. And in this map, the red points are presence records and the blue points are absence records. And when you click on each one of those, you can see things like the behavior, the number of birds, and all of that kind of thing. And then on the left, there's a screen grab of what the app looks like. And I've got more of that in a few slides that show all of the fields that we look for. But I mentioned it's a little flexible and you can cater it to your needs, where you can do this in a systematic way where you identify areas that are promising for pinyon jays. And you say, I think this canyon ought to have pinyon jays in it. And you systematically explore that canyon, whether you're hiking or driving or divvying it up into blocks that you're visiting later, or however you're doing it. But you can systematically investigate these areas and submit absence records if you don't find birds and presence records when you do find birds. Or you can sort of use it in a very opportunistic way where you happen to be out hiking and you hear birds and you just pull out the app and log the birds that you saw, how many, what they were doing, and how far you were from them, and all of that kind of stuff. But between those two options, you can cater it to your needs and kind of go however you want. And these specific goals are flexible based on the local needs. You talk to your coordinators or come up with your own ideas. But an example of a general process is something like systematically identify where the flocks are, figure out the loose boundaries of their home ranges by checking different access points in different nearby areas. And then once you find the birds, identifying where these key behaviors are occurring, right? What part of the home range are they roosting? Where's the nesting colony? Where are they mostly caching? Where are they harvesting from? And putting all of that together is going to create this full meaningful picture that we can communicate to land managers of how to protect what habitats, basically. So I recognize that I am running into an hour here. I don't know if we have a hard hour cut off, but I do have some more material I can go through. But if people have any questions, I do want to give everyone the opportunity to ask me questions directly to make this as valuable as it can be. So please do chime in the chat or however to get me to stop and ask for help if you need it. So absence and presence records, we covered that. This is what the hub looks like. It's linked to on our homepage for GBBO. This is the process with which you do that. You sign up for that free user account and send us an email to ask for access. Outreach at gbbo.org and Bowman at gbbo.org are both work. These are located on the hub. These are sort of training manuals that cover how the thing works and then how to use it in the field and some best practices and tips and what to look for and how to identify behaviors and how to identify habitat, that kind of thing. All this is on the hub website. And then when you're filling out the actual survey form, this is what it looks like. And it's super basic, and we set it up that way on purpose. And for anything else, we have this comments field to add anything else you observe that we haven't accounted for in the preset fields. So like I mentioned, it automatically grabs your location. You don't have to do anything for that other than make sure the app has access to your location. Date and time, time spent at the location, whether or not it's a presence, an absence, or a test record. And so you can submit test records to practice with using the thing just to see how it works. Just make sure you select that so we know it's not actual data. And then if you select presence record, you will get a number of other fields that pop up, like size of flock, activity type. We've got distance to the flock, direction to the flock. Again, this is not super precise. We're not asking you to get out your rangefinder or a measuring tape and measure this distance. You can estimate in yards or meters, whatever I mean, we're asking for meters, whatever you're more comfortable with. For these purposes, a yard is functionally a meter. They are not exactly the same, but it is close enough for these purposes. Um, Direction to the flock just to get a feel for that specific habitat. If they're 500 meters from you, the habitat type could be a little different where the birds are. So then we know where to look, what habitat this is actually referencing. But if you're in the middle of the flock, it's zero, that kind of thing. If you have a distant auditory detection, you can use 999 to say that you didn't actually see the birds or get a distance. And then the photos, you can attach photos from your sort of camera roll, or you can let the app access your camera and take photos there. But these habitat photos are very useful for us because then when we go check these locations, the satellite imagery is not always current and up to date, and a clear cut could have occurred since the satellite imagery was taken, for example. So these habitat photos are great. We don't expect photos of pinyon jays here. If you can, that's amazing. But we certainly recognize that pinyon jays are very difficult to photograph in the best of times, let alone with a cell phone picture. So habitat photos is what we're looking for. And then another thing I've seen the photo field used for is if you're taking notes and you don't want to type it all with your keyboard into the comments field, you can be scribbling into your notebook and upload a screenshot of your notebook. And we don't want to be doing a ton of that because that's a little more effort intensive on our end. But of course, I understand that things are happening fast in the field, and I don't like to be looking at my phone when I'm doing field work and looking at birds. So typing on that thing can be tedious. So if you screenshot your notes, that can work too. And then I've got some examples of the behavior. So we've got flying over versus flying locally in the survey form, and that's basically what it is. If they're flying overhead from one area to another, they're not really using that location where you are currently at. And so that tells us that where you are currently, where the form was submitted from, is an area that birds are generally in, but that it doesn't have a ton of necessarily have a ton of value to the birds. Versus flying locally, in that other photo, you can see they're flying sort of from one tree to another tree, and that would suggest a different level of importance of that habitat. Foraging, Um, I guess really the only thing here is that the distinction between foraging on the ground or shrubs versus foraging in trees, whether they're harvesting pine nuts, whether they're on the ground foraging for grasshoppers, whether, that kind of thing. But we are making a distinction between if they're foraging in trees or if they're foraging on the ground or in shrubs. Resting in trees, basically what it is. If they're resting in trees, they're resting in trees. That's pretty self-explanatory. This happened during the heat of the day when they're not actively foraging or not, and they're not actively flying from one place to another. They might just be resting. And in this form, we are not distinguishing between caching or retrieving caches. It's the same, whether they're retrieving or placing. We just want to know that that is a cache site. It's not always easy to tell. These birds don't really like you to get very close to them. They're very weary and retiring and shy in a lot of cases. Sometimes they're habituated to humans and they're not that way, but often it's not so easy to tell. And so we aren't drawing those distinctions whether you can tell if they're putting nuts in the crop or digging them into the ground. But what I will say is that when they're on the ground, harvesting or I'm sorry, placing or retrieving caches, they also forage for insects on the ground. So just seeing them on the ground, pecking at the ground, doesn't necessarily indicate caching. So just to look closely at what they're doing on the ground. Nesting is referring to active nests, like breeding confirmation, as in we physically saw a bird visiting a nest. It was carrying nesting material, it was bringing food. Um, and they can be very quiet at these nest sites, and it can be pretty difficult to find. The female will flush when you're inches away. She'll wait till the last second. So it can be pretty easy to walk close to nests and not even realize it. And the whole nest searching thing with pinyon jays, I mentioned before, we don't want to encourage a ton of that because it can disrupt them. So we just want to make sure that folks understand that and are very cautious and careful when they're in an area of potential pinyon jay nests. Roosting is dawn or dusk. This is where they're spending their nights. So this is different than resting in trees during the day. Roosting typically occurs as a flock. They will leave their last foraging location together, and they will all fly to the roost site together. In the morning, they will all rise together and leave the roost in a group.
I mean, I think I'm
That is-
but yeah, I'm not sure.
Do we have a question or is someone accidentally unmuted? Maybe some background noise.
Gonna take over that like those office space.
Oh, okay, cool.
She was the type.
Okay, and so visiting feeder is a behavior that we added because we had a lot of folks with birds at feeders. And that's really useful for us to know because as just said a second ago, that some flocks are habituated to humans in human dominated areas and they're not so shy, weary, and retiring. And it's basically useful for us to know if it's a provisioned flock or a wild flock, as they likely behave quite differently. And so drawing those associations is just helpful for us to learn. And it is what it is. If they're visiting a feeder, they're visiting a feeder. I think no further explanation required. Here we go with so basically that's the long and short of our community science effort. It's a growing and developing thing. We're still looking to get new volunteers in new areas. The Fish and Wildlife Service is going to conduct a review, so all of this data will potentially be very useful for them to make decisions from. Like the data you collect could be directly transmitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service to act on. So it is very, very powerful in that way. You are sort of on the front lines, ground level of Pinyon Jay data generation. So your data counts. We've got 263 data collectors in 6 states. I did not update that super recently, so I think we've got a few more now, but still the 6 western states. We're looking to get into Idaho and Montana still, some of these fringe states. But we've got 15 teams that hold regular field trips. We hold regular training events in Reno. The Audubon Southwest is super active down there as well. We've got a few collaborative beer and mead productions there. I think there's another brewery down in Arizona doing a Pinyon Jay benefit beer. So it's a growing, developing effort, and we're excited to have you all on board. And I know that I have taken up about an hour of everyone's time here, which is what I was shooting to do. I do have, I've called it my bad bird photo quiz, that if folks are interested in a little ID quiz, I can go through that. Otherwise, I've covered all the information that I feel that I need to cover. So if folks have any questions, I'd love to take them. And if anyone wants to stick around for the bad bird photo quiz, it's going to be a great time.
I just had a quick question. Is this presentation going to be shared with us as well, just so we can like look back at the calls and everything like that?
Yes, this is recorded and we will get it up on our YouTube channel as soon as it is, and it will be made available to you all for later reference.
All right, thank you so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Well, I don't see a mass exodus of people, so I'm going to jump into a bad bird photo quiz. I'm going to take that to mean people want to see what I've got. So here we go. And they're not all bad bird photos. I guess I had a few in here for just to cover. So first quiz bird. Does everyone know? You can type into the chat, I guess is probably the best way to do this. Or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and holler out, that works too. But this is our first bird. We got no answers, so I'm going to assume everyone recognized this as a pinyon jay. Oh, I do have some guesses. Some type of jay, scrub jay. This bird is a pinyon jay, so they're really variable in their plumage. This guy is holding his head at a little bit of an angle, so that long bill may not be super obvious, but that short tail and the compact body structure. And I'll show my next quiz bird will kind of highlight some of that, I think. Um, but the blue-gray plumage is really variable. But basically, you're seeing not a lot of contrast between the upper parts and underparts, whereas a scrub jay, a little bit more contrast. So here's our next quiz bird. I tried to put him in the same posture for a little more direct comparison. Um, so if we have any guesses here, I can go ahead and talk through it as well. So this is a scrub jay. He's holding his head at an angle and his body at an angle, so the features are not as distinct. But that bill is a bit more stout and not quite as long as a pinyon jay, and that tail is much longer relative to the rest of the body. So it kind of gives this elongated body structure, more slender looking. But these guys co-occur in the same habitat type, so they're commonly seen side by side. We've got our next birds here. I'll just give, 20, 30 seconds or so before I start talking about what these birds are. Yes, Carly, these are pinyon jays, and these are actually juvenile pinyon jays. I used those because I wanted to show how gray the young ones can be. They're not always blue. Obviously, there's a hint of blue there, and even on both of these birds, you can see that pale base of the bill, which is an easy way to pick them out as juveniles because they've got that expandable gape, so they can open their mouths very wide to be fed by the adults. But also juvenile birds' bills do grow. So these birds' bills are not as long as they will be as adults. So they can be a little tricky in that regard, and that they could look like scrub jays because they have these short bills. And juvenile scrub jays will have shorter tails because the tails grow in as well. But these are pinyon jays. Now we get into the bad bird photos. Again, I'll give, a minute or so for folks to ponder on this photo before I explain what we've got. So these are Clark's nutcrackers. Apologies if anyone was typing that in, but they have a really similar body structure to pinyon jays, and that's why I wanted to highlight that because pinyon jays don't always cooperate to give you the best look. So if you see them in silhouette or through fog, as appears to be the case here, they can be remarkably similar to that long bill, short tail, long wing, compact body structure. These are all field marks for both birds. Um, Useful to have the plumage coloration can help you, and then habitat type as well. These birds are perched in some kind of fur, it looks like, and it's not very common to have pinion jays up that high. But again, like I said before, corvids move, so it's not impossible. So we're not wanting to use habitat as a silver bullet field mark here. But these are Clark's nutcrackers. And you can get a bit of the plumage off of this one. So now we're living up to our name, bad bird photos. Yes, this is a Clark's nutcracker. Nice. Darker underwing, and you can see those the white secondaries there as well. Well, you can kind of not see them in that you can tell they're there because the bird's wing looks like it's a weird shape with that lighting. But those white outer tail feathers too, or that almost look like they're not there. Um, Again, similar structure and silhouette to a Pinyon jay, but that'll be a Clark's nutcracker with those white outer tail feathers and white secondaries and dark wings. Yes, Brandy, this is a Pinyon jay. I like to have that side-by-side comparison. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. So you can see that long wing, short tail, long bill. Same structure as a Clark's nutcracker, which is really neat because it's sort of convergent evolution. These birds are really analogous to each other. They serve the same function in different areas. Got our next one. Actually, this is a scrub jay. So he's got a long tail and a short bill. It's tough because he's got that side angle, but you can see that structure again is what I'm trying to drive home with these crappy, obscure, weird photos is that you don't always get the best look of these birds. So really looking for that short bill and that long tail relative to the rest of the body here. And that even deep blue color, Pinyon jay tails are usually pretty gray. That's typically the least blue part of their body, where scrub jays can be pretty evenly blue if you see them in good lighting, of course. And we've got some more distant shots here because this is a more common occurrence. You see them from far off and then they fly away. Yes, Pinyon jay. That's right. That's right. You guys nailing it. So that long bill, you can see that long bill. It's longer than the head is wide or deep or however you want to call that. Long bill and a relatively short tail to the body and that compact sort of chunky structure. And this one's tough because the tip of that tail is a little bit obscured, but yes, with the question mark, a little uncertain. Yes, this is a scrub jay, Carly. You nailed it with that short bill, and you can tell it's got a long tail. I mean, the tip is obscured by those needles, but you can tell it goes a bit longer than you can really see there. So that is a Woodhouse's scrub jay. And by the way, I found all of these photos on eBird, so all of these people felt like these were worth sharing with the world. Nope, so this is not a nutcracker. This is a scrub jay. You can see that a little bit. The lighting is pretty crappy, but you can see a little bit of the blue in the primary feathers and as well as the tail. But even with that weird angle, I think you can sort of tell it's got that long tail relative to the body. It's again, it's tough, and that's sort of the point here is that you get obscure views in it, and while you look through the field guide and you think this is a super distinct bird, easily recognizable from all angles, they're not so cooperative in the field, and so quite frequently you get a view of a bird butt, and you can kind of intuit that that's a bit of a long tail relative to the bird's overall size. Yes, and here we have a Clark's nutcracker. So that structure, that long bill, short tail, compact body, it's really cool. Clark's nutcrackers are basically so they have an origin in the old world, and Pinyon Jay has an origin in the new world, like the rest of our lowercase b blue jays. Whereas they serve the same function and they have separate origins. And the Clark's nutcracker has an analogous feature to the Pinyon Jay's expandable crop. The Clark's Nutcracker has this sublingual pouch that can hold many more nuts than the Pinyon Jay can. So they're in a way much more efficient of a nut harvesting machine. But they do the same thing as Pinyon Jays, and that's why they have those similar structures. And then if I can go to my next one, come on, there we go. And this is our last quiz bird, everyone. Yes, that's right, Brandy. This is a Pinyon Jay. And I think that's a pretty clear shot of that short tail, long bill that I've been saying all evening. That nice powder blue gray Pinyon Jay in the snow. And that QR code goes to our hub website, and that's all I've got for everyone. So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in this evening and for